Live in a treehouse or in a houseboat?
I mean, this one for me is really easy. I was thinking about what the treehouse would look like and how cool it would be, but a houseboat is awesome. My parents actually have a boat that we've gone on holidays on, and they take their cats on the boat, which is really cool. And I can imagine it being pretty sweet. Obviously, you need to find a really sheltered marina to dock up in. You can have power coming to your boat, and you could still have a car that's parked in the marina. So you could live a relatively normal life and then maybe just get out on the waters in the weekends. Not so sure about a tree hut. I don't know.
I think my inner child is like screaming out saying, build a tree hut, because man, I loved building huts as a kid. And the idea of building this like castle in the tree growing up would have been amazing. And it was amazing. Not that any of my tree huts are that great growing up, but I love doing that stuff. I've never dreamed about building a houseboat as a kid. So, and the thought that went through my head as you first did this question was like, would I rather die from a forest fire or by drowning in a river?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the treehouse, you're going to get fit, right? Like going up and down. It depends how often you leave your lair, but like climbing up and down the tree, it's got to keep you pretty fit. Whereas the boat, you might not even have to leave.
I saw like I don't know, it was a documentary or something, a pretty sweet treehouse. I actually think it was in Italy, but it's like an Airbnb and it's like a legitimate, like really flash house in a tree. So I don't, something like that wouldn't be bad.
It's that Ewok lifestyle, right? I'll be down for that.
Yeah, I was going with the Lothlorien vibe, right? You just turn into an elf. Does that mean that you live forever? Has anyone tried it, like living in a treehouse? Maybe that's the secret to eternal life. Who knows?
I think I would definitely choose a treehouse just because I do actually get a little bit seasick. So sure, sheltered marina and stuff, but if the water starts to move a little bit more, if it's really windy, I might start feeling sick. So that's not the best feeling in the world. So I think I'd go for the treehouse, in part because of that, but in part because I also think, like if it's where you live, you could legit go hardcore on it and build something that's really cool looking, but also cool and comfortable as well. So
So does your treehouse have plumbing, guys? Does it have electricity? And how are you cooking your food? I need more answers here. It's just got all of those things. I need details. What's the plumbing like? Is there just like a little hole at the top and this stuff drops down or what?
Well, my tree overhangs a river, and there's just a big long drop that falls onto these houseboats that, you know.
no, okay, so I'll tell you what, mine is very environmentally friendly, and obviously people could say you're abusing the tree. So what happens is mine fertilizes the tree. It collects everything and fertilizes the tree.
I mean, I did ask about that, didn't I? So it's kind of my fault. I just think the idea that like my house is mobile is a pretty cool one. Like if I have a friend that lives in a neighboring harbor or a bay or the other side of the same harbor, then I can just be like, yo, I'm just going to come and dock up next to you this weekend. We'll hang out, we'll play games. Like it's pretty rad. And obviously fishing is quite a fun hobby or pastime.
What about though when you're hanging out with that friend and you're like, I think it's time to go home. Like you can't just go home because you're already home. They're right
Hey,
next door to you.
unlike you, Shem, I'm an extrovert. I'm good. I'm good. I don't get sick of my friends. What are you trying to say, man? What are you trying to say?
You're like, I just gotta go somewhere. Yeah, it's gotta go. You just sail off in your little boat down the Nile a bit, like a few meters down the road.
Is that why you say when I'm at your house? Well, would you look at the time? Oh,
All the time, constantly. Like, you show up and I'm like, what is the time?
must be time to pick up the kids from school, bro. It's 10 a.m.
Welcome to the Lens and Veil podcast. Join Shem, Sam, and Zach as they dive into a designer-focused analysis of Scythe, a game from Jamey Stegmaier.
So today we are talking about a game called Scythe. You must have heard of it. It is a game where players are playing as an asymmetric faction set in sort of an alternate history timeline around 1920s-ish in Eastern Europe, Siberia, Russia, all of those kinds of areas. And players are trying to earn the most points, which are really coins. The player at the end of the game with the most coins will win. Players have not only an asymmetric faction board, but they have also a unique action board. All of these action boards have the same actions on them, but there's a top action and a bottom action, and the pairing of those top and bottom actions on those slots are alternated, and also the costs and rewards for doing those actions are slightly adjusted as well. So there's not only asymmetry in the faction that you choose, but also in the random action board that you get given at the start of the game. On a player's turn, they place their action marker onto one of the 4 action slots where they can do a top row action. Now, these actions in the top row are typically free or very cheap. They might cost a coin to do. And they are to move, which allow them to move some of their meeples or their plastic figurines on the hex map. There's a big hex map in the middle of the board where there's resources are generated, buildings can be built, all that sort of thing. They can bolster, which is where they pay money to increase their combat power or combat cards. They can trade, where they can pay money to gain resources or popularity. Popularity is a track the icon is a heart, and it will assess kind of how well everything else scores at the end of the game for you. Or they can produce, which is where their meeples that are on the map will generate based on the region that they are on. And one of the spots, they can actually generate more meeples. And the really interesting thing is that after doing a top row action, if you have the resources to be able to do it, you may perform the matching bottom row action. And these are paired off in different ways, like I already explained. So the bottom row actions are upgrade, where they can move a cube from their player board from a top row action that makes that top row action better, and they move it down to a bottom row action covering over 1 resource cost to make that bottom row action cheaper. The player could deploy, where they can build mechs. These mechs will gain powers based on the ones that you choose to unlock from your faction board, and all of the powers for each mech that has been unlocked will apply to all of your mechs that are on the map. These are plastic pieces that you can move around and that can do combat with other players' mechs. Players could build, where they spend resources to build one of 4 buildings on the map. Each of these buildings have an unlock benefit and also a power, or maybe a power on the map. Or players could enlist, where they remove a disc from their bottom row of their player board, and that is going to give you that benefit anytime that you do that associated bottom row action, or a player to your left or your right does that bottom row action. Also, when you remove that disc, you get to slot it onto one of 4 immediate benefits just for some more Brucey bonuses. There are about 8 to 10 different objectives at the top of the board. So once a player has done all of their upgrades or all of their deploys or all of their enlists or all of their buildings, a bunch of different things, there's combat, there's a few other ways. Once a player has done all of those things, they get to place 1 star out on that particular category. Once a player has placed all 6 of their stars, so there's about 8 to 10 possible places they could put their stars, but once a player has placed 6 stars, that will immediately trigger the end game, at which point the player with the most coins will win the game. Now, the stars that you've placed out will be worth some coins based on your popularity, as well as the number of regions that you control and the resources that you have in hand, as well as the coins you had generated from your actions throughout the game. So it's a really interesting engine building game with a lot that we can discuss.
So I love games like this, which are in that kind of medium to heavy range in complexity, that have really simple action taking systems. It means you can just on your turn, you just do one little decision and it spirals into all these effects. Obviously, there's a lot of decision around which of those actions you're taking and what you can afford to do. But the fact that the actual action taking mechanism is so simple makes these games really enjoyable for me, for my tastes. Another example would be Lisboa, which is a super heavy game, very heavy. But on your turn, your action is play a card above your board or below your board. So that's how simple the actual system is. But then what you do just spirals out of control. I love that in Scythe, how it's just very simple. Like move your piece to a different spot and take the actions that you can afford to take, basically.
Yeah, one thing I want to talk about, I'm not sure I even explained it in the rules, was the fact that you can't do the same action 2 times in a row. So once you take an action, the first time you take an action, you can pick from any of the 4. But from then on, you've only got a choice of 3 actions. And that kind of restriction is a really cool aid to the player. So they know, okay, I just took produce on this last turn, so I can't produce again. What am I wanting to do on this turn so that my produce on the next turn, I can make use of the bottom row bonus? And this is kind of the mini game of this game, I feel, is trying to make it so that you can do as many bottom row actions as you can. Now, you normally can't do it on your very first turn, so it's just about trying to get that snowball up and running as fast as you can to be able to do top and bottom row. Because if you do, you're taking double as many actions as other players. Well, as the other potential of only taking 1.
Yeah, and obviously you're going to be unlocking those stars for doing each of the bottom row actions can unlock you a star. So they're pretty important from that point of view. I also think it's really clever to implement this in this game because it's the sort of game where you would love to just spam one action. Often you would actually just want to be able to spam an action like 2 or 3 turns in a row, but you can't do that. So you have to think about how you can be efficient with that action, and then you're going to go to another action. You might come back to it, but how can you do another action that's going to help you get to where you want to go? So I think it was quite clever to implement this. In some other games, maybe someone would implement this and it would actually just make it less fun, because you have less choice. But I think in this case, it's kind of the perfect thing to make it more of a puzzle, and it makes the game, I think, more fun. I think we were discussing this before the podcast, how we don't really like the faction that lets you break this rule because it just doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like the same game in some ways. So I think, yeah, it's really clever.
One quite hot topic, I guess, or a very common thing we see now in game design is chaining in games, where Hadrian's Wall, as an example, you do one thing and then all these effects fire off. We talked about it in Unconscious Mind on our last episode a bit as well. And it's very popular because it gives these instant endorphins in the game. So you do something small and all these other effects kind of roll off after it. But the other kind of chaining I prefer, and it's quite strong in Scythe, and Sam mentioned it earlier, is how it's more about setting up your future turns. So if I do this now, then in 2 turns later, I can do this thing and chain off that thing. So it's not about kind of pushing a button and all these things happen. It's about trying to set up these perfect little sequences, I guess, across turns, which makes for that real crunchy puzzle for sure. Even to the point that the upgrade action where you can pull a cube off the top of your board and bring it down to the bottom. Even that as a chain, if I do this, if I get that piece, put it here, that means I now only need 2 food, not 3 food for that action. So when I do that later, I can afford it. So lots of forward planning and lots of little sequencing patterns within the game, which makes the kind of brain burn is all in that puzzle, right? That's the part that I enjoy.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that, about the player feeling here, and to contrast it with chaining. Maybe it is chaining, or maybe it's like engine building, but there's the modern style of chaining, and we put it in a lot of our games, is kind of about getting a lot of dopamine hits. Like, I get this resource, and I get this resource, and it feels really fun, and you're getting lots of stuff. But in this, it always feels very considered. It always feels that the player was in control of this, that none of it was incidental, that you can anticipate everything you're going to get. Because my critique of some of these chains is that you don't even know that it's coming, and you start pushing the pieces along, and by the time you push the 3rd piece, you get something that you weren't aware that you were going to get and you hadn't even considered. Whereas in this, it feels like you had considered everything, and it really makes the player feel smart. That they pulled off that really successful chain that isn't something that the game did for them. The player did it themselves.
Yes, I guess if you said the endorphin rush kind of one, let's call it, it's chaining, that's what we call it anyway. But let's call this one sequencing or something, planning for the future actions.
Yeah.
I think what I was getting at was that chaining and sequencing kind of do the same thing. They give you that feeling of yes, things are happening. Oh yeah, things are popping off. But it's the immediate fix versus the kind of the slow fix, I guess, that one that kicks in later. And the one that kicks in later, like you said, makes you feel smart and clever and rewarded for what you've done previously. Whereas the immediate endorphin rush of the chaining is kind of oh, kind of moments that you kind of surprised by, which feel good, but they're not as rewarding, I guess. And this feels like it's getting quite philosophical, but yeah.
To use an unwholesome and not really family friendly example, and this isn't from experience, but if we're to use the gambling analogies, the sequencing is betting on the team that you know that's going to win, and you feel really smart when you get it right. The chaining is like getting a bunch of scratchies and just hoping that it comes out and you just get all these things lining up.
Maybe you come back for the endorphin rush, right? Like you want that like quick snappy feel of like lots of endorphins. That's what you want, but really you should be having the big meaty meal that is good for you. So on the topic of kind of chaining and sequencing and engine building, this game has that in spades. There's so many aspects of engine building within this game. We talked about upgrade a little bit, where you can move a cube from a top row to a bottom row. So that basically makes one action stronger on the top and cheaper on the bottom. And you can take those from any area. So you could take it from like your left column on the top and put it on the right column on the bottom. So lots of decision there. There's a bunch of other ones. There's recruit, which is a little disc you can move. It gives you a one-time benefit, but then anytime you or your neighbors would take a specific action like deploying a mech, you get some extra reward. There's buildings you can place on the map. 2 of them just kind of buffer the action slightly, and the other 2 give you some kind of ability on the map, such as a tunnel or more harvesting. Then you've got your workers, the meeples that you place out on the map. They're great for area control, of course, spreading out and for gathering more resources. So they kind of buffer your economy a bit. There are the factory cards you can get. If you get to the factory with your leader, you can pick up a card, which is like basically a 5th action slot. So there's a variety of those. They can be quite strong as well. And then lastly, there's also the mech powers. So every time you build a mech, you're unlocking 1 of 4 possible powers for all of your plastic pieces in the game. And there's variety and asymmetry in those as well. So there's tons of stuff to talk about here for asymmetry and engine building for sure.
So talking about the last one first, the mechs, I realized that actually in Circadian's First Light Specialists, I've done the exact same thing, and I must have been influenced by Scythe. I don't remember crediting it, but I love this idea that when you unlock a mech, so the first time you unlock one, you're picking where it comes from your player board, where it comes from, and that is going to unlock that power for that mech. And then the next one you unlock, you've now got 2 mechs on the map, and they've both got both of the powers that they come from. And Circadian's First Light Specialists, the expansion, also does this. And it's just a really fun thing. Like, instead of just having these mechs off to the side and you can get these cool pieces that you could put on the map, if you can, put them on a board, and where they come from, where they unlock from, also gives a bonus. And we'll see that this is a theme with this game, that there's double rewards. There's making things cheaper and getting more benefit for taking the action. And that kind of thing is, I find, to be super satisfying. And it's literally just done with very clever kind of graphic design and product design is the right thing. It's all just revealing new icons, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense to the player, done in a really nice way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And talking about the upgrade action, it is so intuitive. I remember the first time I learned the game, just you're moving a cube from up the top to down the bottom, and it was just revealing all the icons and, just explained everything. And so it's just so easy and intuitive, but actually just so clever, and it feels so good as the player doing it as well. So I think this is it's a really masterful way of an upgrade or a kind of a research system. And also the fact that, as Sam said right at the beginning, in one of them it's giving you more stuff, and one of them it's making you pay less stuff. So it's not just improving both rows in the same way, but it's improving them in different ways. So yeah, I take my hat off to that, because to be able to make cool research systems that are also so simple and also components wise so intuitive, I don't think that's particularly easy. And I mean, we could ask Jamey how long it took him to come up with that, but yeah, it's pretty cool.
As someone who loves engine building in games, and as someone who likes multiple paths to victory and being able to explore and express myself in different ways in different games, this is a game to learn from, because they have multiple, as Shem had said, they have multiple ways of engine building. And that for me is absolute catnip, because I want to be able to try different things in different ways. And the reason why I think this is so cool is it creates this min-max angst, where if I take the bolster action, I could upgrade the bolster action to get more combat power every time I do it, or I could build the monument so that I gain popularity every time I do it. But I can't ever take the bolster action every single time with all of those benefits. I'm going to need to pick one or the other first. So what do I want? Do I want the bonus first, or do I want the upgrade first? And that min-max angst is such a fun feeling for the player, because it's not obvious what you're going to go for first. Or you could go for the enlist bonus for the bottom row action. The player is constantly asking themselves the question, which of these bonuses do I lean into first? Do I want to conserve my resources so I can do it again more efficiently? Or do I want to get a jump on getting popularity now? Or maybe I need to make sure that every time other players do these actions, I'm getting bonuses now.
And can I just add one thing there? I think it's really clever because there are different ways of doing engine building as well. For example, if you're upgrading, you're basically guaranteeing if I do this action, it's going to give me more stuff and it's going to be cheaper on the bottom. Whereas if you do the enlist, you're like, okay, I'm getting some stuff instantly, cool. But I'm betting on what the other players next to me are going to do. So there's a decision about like, do I want to go with trusting in myself to be able to get more from it from the actions that I do, or do I bet? Do I take a gamble on what the people next to me are going to do, and maybe that could actually get me more resources and help me more in the game. Like I think that's a real key around what you were talking about, Sam, with like how different types of engine building and why it becomes catnip is because it's not just the same thing in different areas of the game. It's like different sorts of engine building, and I mean, you've already talked about it with the mechs as well. It's like a completely different system, and yeah, I think that just is just so much fun as a player because you don't know what to choose. Like you have to choose a path. There's not just like an obvious thing. It's not like, oh, just upgrade and you'll win the game. Like actually maybe you should enlist first round because then you're just going to get way more resources from when people do those actions. So
Yeah, what's interesting also is that 4 of these engine building actions, the upgrade, deploy mechs, building, and enlisting, they're all tied to these bottom 4 actions on your player boards. So it's interesting to me that like in a game like this, where I guess you could compare these 4 actions a little bit like to mini games. It's like, which mini game are you going to play this game? Are you going to do the mechs? Are you going to do the buildings or whatever? It's interesting that all 4 of these have engine building in them. Like quite often when there's mini games, one's about air control and one's about like set collection and one's about points scoring in the game or something like that. But all 4 of these have this engine building element. So no matter what kind of path you're going, you're getting buffed in some way. There's not kind of like some sacrifice of like, oh, if I go mechs, that means I get no powers. Or if I go enlist, I get no powers. They're all giving you stuff within the game, which is really interesting. And then the wrinkle of the whole, like, which top row goes with which bottom row, what's the cost, what's the coin reward? Like, there's such a big wrinkle there of like, at the start of the game, what is my focus going to be? I think it's usually recommended to kind of focus on the ones that give you more coins because that's points. So if your 3 and your 2 coins are on, say, upgrade and deploy mix, then that's probably the 2 things you want to hit the most. But you don't have to hit those the most. You can do other stuff as well and do a bit of everything. So really clever. And also just, I think it's, as a design, it's quite a challenge to pull off something like this. Like to have that many areas of engine building in the game. It's very clever.
So let's talk a little bit about player direction in this game and then also generally player direction, because this is something we're going to keep coming back to, which I find super interesting because I'm someone who doesn't love too much player direction. I don't want the designer to completely hold my hand and tell me, hey, you should be doing this, otherwise you're missing out on points. And there are a lot of subtle ways that the game directs players. Now, the maybe not so subtle way that I'm not usually a fan of is the little private objectives. You can do one of the 2 that you're given over the course of the game, and you get a star for doing that. I think that's fine. Like, it's okay. It doesn't excite me. It's not by any means the best part about the game. It gives players a little bit of direction. You could ignore it if you want to. There's a fair degree of randomness. There are some that might work with your strategy, and there are some that completely don't. But I want to talk about all the other little ways that players are given direction. One is on a turn-by-turn basis. The fact that the action they just took is blocked means that players are directed to one of the 3 other actions. Also, based on the action boards they have, there's typically one action that isn't very good for the player. And so as an experienced player, or maybe not even as an experienced player, that's usually an action you want to ignore, or maybe only do once to get that one mech out that you need. So I'm looking here at the patriotic board, and there's the build action costs 4 wood, so the most resources it could cost without having been upgraded of all the actions. And it gets you a building, but it gets you no coins. So straight away, I'm looking at that action, I'm thinking, okay, so build isn't very good on this board. You don't really want to do that. So then if you've blocked a previous action, you're really only thinking about 2 other actions. And even though that sounds restrictive, that's actually a cool amount of direction for the player. But there's also direction in other ways. There's direction based on the map So everyone starts what I'll call an island. There's like rivers between them, but they start on an island with 3 hexes. Their starting meeples start on 2 of those hexes, and then they can easily access one of the others. These hexes will generate particular resources, and so they might generate wood and iron and meeples, say. And so that's directing you towards building, deploying, and getting more people out. And that is giving players direction around which actions they can do well for the bottom rows because they're generating those resources. So what do you guys think about the direction in this game?
So, for example, for me, talking about player direction and what we prefer, I find that sort of direction on the board in terms of some actions better than others. I don't really like it that much. Yeah, I understand why, because of, as you said, it gives people direction about I've got less actions to think about. I think it also does another thing. It makes it so there's no optimum way of playing the game. Like every time you play, there's not like, okay, I'm going to upgrade twice and then I'm going to, So it does that, which I think is a good thing. But personally, I don't like that being like restricted into my playstyle, Like in a game, I want to have as much choice as possible. So feeling like, oh, I got this board, I can't really build. Like building kind of sucks this time around. I don't know, maybe if other players it's like, oh, okay, it's a challenge, they just take it on. I would prefer as a player to have that choice to play any play style I wanted when I start the game. And I think there's enough in the, having the different factions and the different starting places to be a bit of variation in the different mech powers and stuff like that. So that's kind of my personal take, but I can understand why that decision was made.
I think it's a really clever way of giving direction without forcing them down a path for sure. So you've got these, I think they all have one that gives you a person as a starting, or one starting 3. So you've actually got 2 resources that you get given as an easy access on the map at the start, mostly protected, I guess you could say, for the first half of the game or something. And then you've got this player board, which there's the 4 actions at the bottom, which all cost one of the 4 main resources. So your opening like setup on the map is basically saying like what resource is going to access and are those good for me to get these abilities out quickly. Like if your 3 and your 2 coin actions at the bottom, your primary 2 actions you should be doing, line up with the map, then you're set up. Like these are great. So there is some variation there that might lead to like stronger openings, which could be an issue, I suppose, but you can spread out fairly quickly and there's ways you can get around it, like getting out your mech quickly or building your mine and getting out of the island, as Sam called it. But as a comparison, when I play your game, a Chaos Order, often your 2 starting hexes in that game, if they're both harvesting gems, for example, I then go, I probably don't need to build strongholds because I don't need that gem income. Or if my starting ones give me tons of cards, then maybe I won't build outposts. So you kind of do react to the starting spots in Chaos Order as well. Like you're starting harvesting and maybe even where you can build your buildings on the foundations. Those immediate effects are also kind of taken into account for me when I'm like first opening the game, I guess you could say, like the first few rounds of the game. Obviously, it changes for both Chaos Order and Scythe as you start unfolding the game. But those opening moves, it kind of gives me a similar feeling. I think Chaos Order is probably less restrictive, but there's that same kind of motivations that are given to you. Like, this is what you have easy access to. Try and use that quickly and then, evolve your strategy from there.
Yeah, and I think Chaos Order is less restrictive, but then it's a bigger decision space, right? So then there's a negative to that as well. It's not just a positive. So, I mean, that's the trade-off.
Yeah, I think this direction is done in a way that really, really pleases me because, as I said, I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with player direction, but I never feel like the designer is kind of breathing down my neck telling me what to do. Like in games where I get this card that says, at the end of the game, get 3 points per building, then I feel like if I don't build, I'm in trouble. I'm not going to be able to do well. But this sort of feels a little bit obfuscated to me, which is super cool. My playstyle in these kinds of heavy or medium heavy Euro games is typically either spam one thing and do that really, really well with a lot of focus, or it's ignore one thing because you can never do, well, not never, but it's usually not very strong to try and do every single thing in the game. And so for me, this makes it super clear, but it makes it feel like I'm making the decision and not the game. I can't explain that, but it sort of feels obfuscated that, okay, yeah, I can happily ignore build and then I'll hit these other 3 things based on my starting resources and how good my board is. I will say, and usually that this isn't a very fair thing to say, but I have played this game a lot of times. There can be some combinations that are straight up awesome. And there can be some combinations where it's super, super rough just trying to get out of the island. Like you're forced to do like, you might not generate any metal in your starting 3 areas. And then you're forced to do one of these really expensive build actions to build a monument to be able to get out. Or you might be forced to do a trade action to be able to get the metal to be able to build a mech that can walk over rivers. And sometimes that's a really cool challenge, but I also think that like some combinations are a little bit better than others. Now, in the end, that doesn't bother me because I find the puzzle of my starting island and my action board to be delightful. I find it to be such a satisfying puzzle that I don't necessarily care if I've got the best combo or not. But I will just say there are some combos that are really, really hard just to get out of your little island and cross the seas into different lands.
Yeah, for sure. I guess it's one of those things that is a problem, but from a design point of view, like, was it something they felt they needed to fix, I suppose? Does the value of the variation outweigh the unfairness of some combos, I suppose? And I think we know they've outruled some, right? There's some that say, don't use this combo. It's broken or whatever. So they've already kind of stated that. There's 2 other areas of asymmetry or direction that come into the game, and they're both from your player mat, from your faction mat. So one is that you have a starting power. We have hinted at some of those already. We've got one that can use the same action twice, one that can cross the rivers with your meeples, one that can spend combat cards as resources, lots of stuff that goes on there. And they're not like overly directive in how you play, but they do give you a nice little advantage in one area of the game, or at least some distinction between players, which is good for variability at the very least. And the other area is the mechs that you place. So I believe that 2 of them are identical between players. So you have one that lets you do 1 extra move per movement, 1 extra hex, and one that gives you access from rivers, I think it is, into one of 2 terrain types. So there is some variation between them there, but it's kind of the same power. And then the 2 other mech powers are unique. There might be some crossover, but they're mostly unique between players. Some might mean that you can go in and out of lakes. One might mean that you get like combat power before you fight. They're not so much directive, but they are giving you some difference between players throughout the game and things that you can kind of lead into and take use of as well.
For me, that's a perfect type of asymmetry as well. And we did a similar thing with the attributes for the factions, and the fact that, well, in Chaos Order, you start with all 3 or 4 attributes, but you can upgrade them over the course of the game. So you would get a choice within the asymmetry which things you want to choose in which order, and then that's going to have an effect on how you play the game. And so I really like that sort of asymmetry where there's also choices in it. So it's not just restricting the player, railroading them into one play style, but you have choices that allow you to do different play styles with the faction that you have. So I find that kind of mech choice quite satisfying. I mean, often you'll just choose one because you really need to get out of your island or whatever. But yeah, maybe when you're getting your 2nd or 3rd mech out, there's some interesting choices about which one you're going to pick.
Yeah, totally. I love that idea of having asymmetry, but there's still a ton of player agency as to how they develop and unlock their asymmetry. Just like potentially the elephant in the room, I want to talk a little bit about Rustviet because they're the faction that can take the same action twice in a row. They can just keep doing the same action. So that core action loop, that core like mini game of moving your marker to a different spot, they just completely skip that. They don't have to play that game. They are interesting to play because you can pull off lots of different sequences than you normally could. But I always get the feeling that like I'm not playing the same game, and that puzzle that also directs players and stuff is taken away. And I always wonder about asymmetric player powers that do this sort of thing. Like I tried to put something in there with Circadian's First Light with a faction that basically like didn't care about dice placement. They could put any die as any value, and they didn't care about the core kind of programming element. But then it was just like, well, are they playing the same game? Is that even a cool power? They skip doing the thing that is quite interesting. I'm never so sure about these kinds of powers. What do you guys think?
I actually think this is a bit of a noob trap, this power. So it's one of those powers from a design point of view that's very much like, you may as well just throw this in there because it's simple. Any player can just go, I can understand that rule. It's easy, whereas some of the other powers might be more complex to figure out. I actually think the bait or the problem with it is that you end up hitting the same spot so many times that late game, it's dumb to hit that spot. Like say it's a spot where you build your mechs, right? And it's like movement and mechs, like sweet, what a cool combo. I can like move out and put mechs down. But halfway through the game, you're like, oh, I don't want to do the bottom action anymore. So movement's kind of dumb now because I can't also benefit from the bottom row. So it kind of like shoots yourself in the foot, I think, where it's like it feels good at first, but then it just like this is not a good thing to do, and you shouldn't really abuse it. So if you're going to play this game and play that faction, I would say don't overuse that power. Like use it in the moment tactically. I don't know. There's no real quick fix for that, like to tell player not to use it every turn. But I think it's definitely a trap for sure.
But how do you feel about it as a designer, or just as the design idea of like skipping the core intrinsic action loop that you just don't get to play that? Well, you don't have to play that same interesting system that everyone else does.
So that doesn't bother me so much because the main loop for me in my mind is actually more like, can you do top and bottom together in the same turn? And this faction can't do that often because unless you're hitting produce and then spending those resources straight away, or trade and spend them straight away, you can't really do that loop over and over. You can't be like, I'll move and spend my 4, whatever it is, to enlist, and they'll do that again because you don't have 4 more. So that loop kind of breaks when you run out of resources. So it doesn't bother me so much, I guess. I haven't played these guys in a while, and I don't think I was that really like drawn to play them. It felt like a very like basic level faction to play and wasn't that interesting. But I think this is probably a great faction for new players. So, and sometimes games need a bit of that, like some that aren't that great, but they're easy to get into.
Yeah, I played them recently and they felt a little bit easy, like easy mode. Just in the fact that, I mean, Scythe is a game where you can get like a bunch of workers out, chuck them on one spot, get all the resources that you need, spam that action 4 times, move them onto the next spot, spam that action 4, if you get what I'm saying, like I was able to do a loop that was pretty like abusive, it felt like. So yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of on board with Sam, and I like people playing the same game, and it just kind of breaks the feeling of the game for me.
Here's my conjecture. If this game was being made today, there would not be a bully faction. I just don't think there would. There's a faction that can get infinite stars. They can get all of their stars from combat. And even though it's actually quite hard to do because you need to have a really good combat power engine and you need to use a lot of cards and stuff, they definitely can create a negative gameplay style where someone is actually just bullying someone else. I guess the counterplay is that you just don't get your mechs back onto the map so that they can't get combat victories from you. And in that way, it's analogous to playing against Draic in our Circadian's Chaos Order game. But I think they're fun. I think they're interesting, but they are definitely a bully faction if played properly.
So we talked a bit about these kind of like, we call them islands, but the areas of the map that you start on with the rivers around them, these are kind of safe zones where you start the game. The map also has lakes, which border, there's only like, I think about 6 of them maybe. And there are some mech powers that can move between lakes, which is interesting. They act a bit like tunnels. There are some powers that you just move in and out of lakes. Then there are these 6 tunnels around the center of the board, which kind of brings the map to be a lot smaller than it is, right? And you guys did a similar thing with tunnels for, I think it's 3 to 5 play games of Chaos Order. So you don't just get stuck in a corner and you can't get out. It also means that factions that are opposite each other on the map can interact, which is great. So the tunnels really bring everyone closer. We've got things about like movement on the map. We've got about resources being on the map. How do you guys feel about the map kind of systems in general?
I think the resources being on the map is quite clever. I quite like that system, especially being a game where you can, as I said before, you can spam like a heap of resources. You could spam like, 6 to, I think you can get out 8 workers, maybe. So you could spam 8 resources. Then that's tempting for other players to then be like, hey, yeah, I know you've got enough resources to finish all your actions. Well, I'm just going to come in with my mech and come and steal those resources off you by winning the battle. And I think that's quite a cool little tension to the game of being like, if you're greedy, people can come over and punish you for being greedy. Or maybe you can spread out your workers a bit more and just harvest a few resources each, and maybe you're less of a target. And I always like greed in games, playing on people's greed and being like, yeah, be greedy, see how it goes, can you pull it off? And so I think that resource system is quite clever, and how also the resources like follow you when you move, and how mechs can pick up workers and move the workers with them. So like all your workers have individual movements, but if they jump on a mech, they can all move together. I think there's a lot of really cool mechanics in terms of the movement on the map.
Yeah, I'm always looking for cool innovations with resource gathering, and I think the fact that they are held on the map is interesting. It makes it clearer also for other players how much everyone has and what they can do. Like if you're holding all your resources in your play area, like an architects or whatever, you have to kind of peer over to be able to see what they're capable of. And here it's a lot clearer. I think it makes a lot of sense within the game. The game is sort of trying to be a 3x game. I would say it's actually much more just a Euro style game with a small combat element, but it definitely feels in line with the theme to hold the resources and regions. And yeah, little things like the tunnels, I think that is a really clever way of making a big map smaller. So you can put more hexes, places of interest, and interesting things on the map and not have to make it smaller because you have added tunnels to make mobility and those regions more accessible. I think that's a really sweet thing. And as already mentioned, the rivers at the start of the game, your little island, that is just such a fun little puzzle and mini game. How am I going to get off my island? It sort of reminds me of this video game we played, RuneScape, where you're on Tutorial Island and you need to try and like get off of Tutorial Island as fast as you can so you can actually start playing the real game out there. But I have once challenged myself to play the game never leaving my island and win, and I have won one time, never leaving my island, but I would not recommend it.
The other kind of cool central focus on the map is the factory in the middle. This is a spot that's basically worth 3 territories at the end of the game. So it's worth holding, worth controlling at the end of the game. But also, the first time you get there with your leader, your main piece in the game, you get to look at these factory cards, choose one and keep one, which becomes the 5th action slot for you. They always give you usually quite a decent cost for a very strong action. And then you always get to move 1 unit 2 spaces as kind of the free bottom action, which means you get a lot more mobility. You can do like 2 moves back to back quite easily. But it does, I've noticed that the cost of these actions do start to hamper your points quite a bit, or your popularity or whatever it might be. I like how there's a central focus for the players. The game is kind of telling you want to go here at some point in the game. Do you rush out there quickly and then retreat? Or do you try and hold it for the whole game? Or do you wait for your moment to jump in there with all your mix and do a big battle to push someone out? Yeah, I like it how it just brings all the players have one focus, right? Like a lot of these games that take the tunnels away, for example, they just have you fighting with your neighbor the whole game. And that's it. There's no reason to go further in, no other motivations to go deeper. But the factory in the middle kind of gives you that central focus. And the other little one I just came to mind was these encounter tokens. So the map gets seeded with these encounter tokens at the start of the game. There's roughly kind of, I don't know, let's say 3 within range of most players that you could probably rush to get to. And when you get there with your leader, you get to draw an encounter card and choose one of the 3 options. Usually a free option, a small cost option, then a big cost option. And they really make you want to rush out there with your leader and pick them up. And especially to deny the other players, the ones that are nearby their bases.
So I think the best thing about the encounter cards is the rule in the rulebook that says when you pick up an encounter card, you must display the artwork to every other player. Yeah. No, I kind of love that because the artwork is actually pretty fantastic in the game. So they were just making it a rule of the game that you had to appreciate the art. Yeah, the encounter cards, like, I don't know, like I find them a bit too random and like just sometimes stuff that you really don't need and don't want. But I totally agree in terms of needing to have that kind of outward focus. And I think every game that wants to have kind of like that combat sort of dudes on a map, any sort of thing like that, needs to have points of interest that people are going to fight over, kind of king of the hill stuff going on. Because otherwise it does just become that kind of like bash your neighbor and like, yeah, you don't interact with the players on the other side of the map. And so I think that's really clever. And in the factory, the whole idea of having another action as well, I find that's really cool. I remember the first time I played the game, I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Like, if I go there, get to choose a new action. And like first in, first served is going to get better action kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's really key in this sort of map-based game.
With the factory, I was forever wanting to do something like that for Paladins of the West Kingdom, because like being able to take a new action card that you could slot workers onto and do an interesting, cool thing like that really inspired me, and I really wanted to try and put it in, but it didn't really work. It didn't. Well, we sort of did something similar with the expansion, but not the same. But that was definitely something that inspired me. You talked about the randomness of the cards. I kind of agree. The encounter cards are random, but they do have a bit of a theme. There's always an option to gain popularity and maybe resources or coins, something little. And then there's an option to spend money to get something else. And then there's an option to spend popularity to get something awesome. And so maybe the thing that you're being offered isn't the thing that you want. Maybe you really want a mech and you're offered a building, and your building row is really powerful, so you wouldn't want to miss out on that opportunity. So maybe yes, there's a randomness in what it's offering you that could be super beneficial or not. But I kind of feel like the game needs that randomness. And the reason I think that that's the case is otherwise the game could get quite like stale or solvable, because there is nothing else that is random in this game apart from the setup. So the things that are unpredictable is what other people will do. And that's pretty much it. So these encounter cards keep it feeling a little bit fresh. That leads us to a discussion that I think is really interesting with this game around tactics versus strategy. So this might be some board game lingo that people use all the time. But generally, when we say strategy, we talk about kind of long-term planning, your sort of overall goal, multi-turn sequences. And when we talk about tactics, we talk about what's good for me to do right now. What's a cool thing that I can swoop up and grab straight away. And this seems to me to be a game that is very far along towards strategy on the spectrum. And I think this is really interesting in this game because we talk about analysis paralysis and we talk about cognitive load in games. And if you compare this to a game like Wayfarers, in Wayfarers, there are so many cards that are face up in so many different markets that are not constantly, but are often changing. And there's just a lot of information for players to pass. There's a lot of cognitive load in a game like Wayfarers on, oh, what's possible? What could I take? What would I want to take? And then constantly having to update that based on which cards disappear and how they change with workers on them, influence on them. So it's a lot. So I think analysis paralysis in that game comes from the amount of information. And I think the cognitive load in this game is not from that at all. In fact, it's really, really light in that sense because not a lot is changing between turns. The game state is mostly pretty static. Other players might swoop in. There might be a hex of contention every now and then, but it doesn't happen that often. And so the cognitive load in this game is one that I think is quite unique to this game, and that is the turn horizon. You can see so far into the distance because you can plan out potentially 3, 4, 5 turns in advance. And so it's really on the player how much they're willing to plan out is how much load they're feeling. Like they could just plan what's good for me now, or they might plan this turn and next turn, or they could plan a 3 or 4 turn sequence if they want. So I find that to be like a super interesting way to have cognitive load, and it's an opt-in thing. Like a player does not have to interact with it on that level if they want. But I'm interested what you guys think about this.
I think there is still a lot of tactics in the game. As someone who enjoys tactics in games, like jumping on the moment and seeing that kind of stuff. But I think it usually is more, as you were saying, like it's reacting to the other players. So if a player suddenly leaves all these resources unattended, it's like, oh, maybe I should jump in now and grab that. The tactical moments, like you're sort of saying, are more built around your sequencing, your strategy. So in the moment, you're like, oh, this is a great time to do this. But it's not because it's just by chance. It's because you've actually been building towards it for quite a long time, whether you knew it or not. So you're kind of responding to your own decisions quite a lot in this game. And yeah, the load is very low in this game. But yeah, that sequencing, that planning is very high. And we have a friend, Ben, who's just like an absolute boss at Scythe. Like he just is always scoring like 120 plus, always winning, to the point that his family asked the question after a game, who came second? Like that's just the question they asked because there's no doubt that Ben has destroyed them. And he's someone who plays strategy. He'll play the long game, every turn kind of planned out in advance. So it definitely rewards those kind of players.
It's a different kind of meal than what I'm used to in games, and I love it. Like, I love that feeling of just being able to plan out. Yes, there is tactics in this game, like you've said, Shem. I think there is something missing, though, for the tactical player, I think. But a game can't do everything. You know, that's the trade-off. Like, to be able to plan that far in advance and to have that much fun with your strategy, you can't have things just propping up all the time that people have to adapt to. You can't put tactics in a game that is a strategy. So it's just kind of the other side of the coin. And I think it's a really interesting trade-off to have a game that's not pure, but as pure strategy as this one is.
But I mean, a little bit of pushback on that is that a player can come and attack you and steal all those resources that you'd plan to use, right? So, I mean, there can be big moments in the game where someone messes up your strategy and you have to adapt to it, which could be frustrating for that strategic player who's got everything planned out, right? Yeah, I agree that it's definitely that sort of game where you want to have like your full game planned out in your head. But I think there are still enough little things in the game to make it so that you can get upset. Your long term plan can be upset, which I think is important. Otherwise, it's just going to be what you planned out is going to happen, and that's it.
And that's the main or only way that your plans can get interrupted is if players do that. It's not from the randomness that the game is offering. It's purely based on other players. That's where the unpredictability comes in. So should we move from that into talking about the combat in this game? Zach, what are your thoughts about the combat in this game?
Yeah, so I'm someone who enjoys combat in games, especially when you have to think about it in the moment of the combat, so you're not just tossing two dice. So I actually quite like the combat in this game, and many people have drawn similarities between this and Chaos Order, even though maybe with Chaos Order we were more inspired by Kemet and June. But essentially in this combat you have something called power, which is one of your resources, which you can have up to 14 power. It's a resource you can gain, and then when you enter into combat, basically each player decides how much of their power they want to spend, up to 7. And then for each plastic piece that they have in the combat, they can also add a combat card. And now the combat cards go from 2 extra power to 5 extra power. So if you have multiple mechs or even your leader in the battle, then you can add multiple combat cards, which can really tip the scales. You can also see how much combat power other people have, like how much of that resource they have. So you might be someone who has 14, and you see someone who has 2, and you can just go in and stop them because you know that they can't add that much apart from cards, maybe. So, I mean, some of those aspects like that maybe isn't something I love because I like battles to be up in the air, like have a certain amount of unpredictability. And I think in this game, like you can often just be like, yeah, I'm going to win this battle. I'm going in and just go in where you know you're going to win. But in saying that, it does have that kind of greed element of like, combat power is a valuable resource and you don't really want to spend 7 of it if you can help it, right? And so can you get away with spending a bit less? Can you get away with playing one of your 2s as a combat card instead of spending your 5, so like I think there are some interesting decisions there around like how much can I get away with, which I absolutely love in combat. So yeah, I think overall it's very simple but does make you think about those things, and has a little bit of unpredictability because of that kind of greed aspect as well.
Yeah, there are a lot of subtleties to the combat, not so much in the combat itself, but like preparing for it as a defender or as an attacker. One of the little wrinkles I quite like is how if you're the attacker, if you go and attack someone who has workers in that hex, you're going to lose popularity for those workers. So you could actually use your workers as a defense mechanism. Like, you're going to attack me, come at me, you're going to lose some popularity, which is ultimately probably going to be points lost at the end of the game if you don't regain them. So little things like that. There's also the fact that once you reach the end of the strength track, you'll get a star. So if someone's like 1 point behind that, you kind of know they don't want to spend any combat power right now because they're 1 step away from getting that star. So there's all these little mind games. They're very simple and like maybe not that much decision up front really, but they're so subtle that they do become quite important. But I think the key thing is that combat is not a massive focus in this game. For most players, you can get 2 stars from it. And because it's not that big of a part, I like how the combat's quite simple.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, actually. This is where my take has sort of changed over plays of Scythe. I think the combat system, there are a lot of subtleties. There is bluffing. All of that is interesting. And I like the fact that I can defend myself. In games like Root, there's a combat system that we have sort of spoken about. We don't love it. It is very clean. So like Scythe and Root both have very clean combat systems. But the difference in this is at least as a defender, I can defend myself. I've got a decision to make, and I really like that. I think if the combat system was any cooler, you would want combat to happen more, right? And so actually, I don't want the combat system to be any cooler because this is not a combat game. It's a game where combat is a vital part of it. Otherwise, people are just in a vacuum playing their own mini games. So it's a vital part of it. there might be about 2 to 5 combats over the course of a game on average. And so that's not that many of the turns in the game where there's going to be a combat. And lots of the times it will just be a one-sided combat. So there aren't that many times where it's a super close combat, 2 or 3 times in a game. And so we don't want to have the absolute coolest, most convoluted combat system that takes a long time to explain when you're not going to get the payoff from that.
The other aspect I like, and it kind of brings it back into that same action loop that we've been talking about, the puzzle, is how you can only get 2 stars. So unless you're playing Saxony, which have an unlimited amount of stars for combat. So if you're the aggressive player and you rush out there and attack quickly and get your 2 stars, that's you for the game. Like, you can't get any more stars from this. So that big moment at the end where if you could go attack at the factory to win it isn't as good for you. And what that does is it means that if you are rushing, you're probably making suboptimal moves in order to rush, because you're breaking that loop or doing an action out of sequence. So you're kind of, in a way, hampering yourself by being aggressive. So it's not about like, will you camp or will you rush out? It's more about like striking at the right moment to get that easy star without kind of ruining your flow and your sequencing of your actions.
Yeah, and I've heard people describe it as a Cold War game, and it is that in some ways, where you're like not wanting to attack every turn. You're wanting to do your own thing, but you're waiting for that moment when you're going to get the most benefit, where you're maybe going to get a star, and the factory you're going to get a star and some resources that you can then use. A star without losing popularity because the person's got a bunch of workers there.
So I already mentioned that there was an elephant in the room, but it turns out that this elephant has a big, big brother, a really big brother, and that is the in-game trigger. So the game ends at the end of the action that the player places their 6th star, and it's over. No more turns. So what this means is that some players will not have the same number of turns. Now, this is a controversial in-game trigger. And at the start, it's going to sound like my take is like that this isn't very good, because I think that this in-game trigger is not fair. Like, it is not balanced and it is not fair. However, mid-thought turnaround, I think that this is for the best for the game. And this is a trade-off that I want to talk about. And the trade-off is that I think this is the most exciting and the most fun way to end the game. If we were to finish the round, then I think that would be more fair, but less exciting. And I think if we were to finish the round and have one more turn, again, more fair, but less exciting. I've got more things to say about this, but I want to hear what you guys think about this first.
It doesn't bother me, really. I quite like the system, and I'm really one of those people who like, who cares if I got one less turn than the person who finished. I don't really care. I think the game is big enough that, like, I don't feel like that's going to decide me winning or losing the game, if you know what I'm saying. Even maybe if it is, but the game doesn't make me feel like that's the case, at least for me.
Yeah, every game you have to approach differently, and we get a lot of pushback on our games about this as well, games that do end with unequal turns. There's games like Architects where it's kind of ticket to ride rules, right? Like everyone gets one last turn, including the player that triggered it. Makes for an exciting finish, and everyone gets one last little dig at getting some points at the end. So it's a halfway point. Got games like Wayfarers, which I think do the same thing. Then we've got games like Scholars, which are like, no, these turns have to be equal because it's a very mathy kind of action-taking game. And we often will go back and forward on trying different methods and seeing which one is the best. There's a game that Sam and I are working on right now, which we've gone through quite a few different in-game triggers, and like we've tried 2 extra rounds or immediate finish or all sorts. And it's really about finding the right feel. It's not so much about fairness and balance. But for some games it is, right? Like if it's a game where you only get 12 turns each, then you have to have those 12 turns each. But in a game that you get like, say, 30 or 40 turns, does one turn really make that much difference? Like, is it that big a factor? And if it is unfair still, does that actually matter? Like, is the game less enjoyable because of that? And sometimes, yes, sometimes it is. And for some people, this is more of a factor. Like, this is probably a deal breaker for some people, especially the more very like strategic, non-like Euro gamers will hate this in games. And that's fair. Like they don't have to they don't have to agree with it. But I don't think as a designer you have to be beholden to those rules. You want to make the game like the best version of itself that you can. The other cool thing about this though, and which takes away some of that moment of like, oh, I didn't think it was going to end, is that you are tracking stars. So you kind of as a player have control in the tempo of the game. Much like Wayfarers, you can see someone rushing the end of the general track. You know that they could end it. It's possible. And all players know that. It's not a hidden information where like you play this card and game over. Like you didn't see it coming. So the star kind of tension and the star interaction is really fun. Where like if someone's on 4 or 5, like they could strike, and you'd be aware of it. So if you don't want them to strike, maybe you attack them, maybe you take away the factory from them, or give them some motivation to continue playing the game so that you can catch up.
And the mitigating factor is the fact that actually, if you place out your 6 star and you trigger the end game, that does not necessarily mean you win. So we still add up the points. It feels racy, but it's not a complete race game where it's first across the line wins. But this is a really interesting design decision. And the game that Shem talked about that we're developing right now, that we're working on now, I am convinced that people will complain about this in-game trigger when they play this game. And so you must be thinking, so why are you doing it? Why don't you fix it? Because I think even if people complain and don't like it, that leads to the most fun, the most memorable moments, and I think it makes the game better. And in fact, I can say, like, hard on hand, we have tried 3 or 4 different ways of ending the game. And even if one of them might be a little bit more balanced in a vacuum, although I'm not even convinced about that, I think that the way that we have landed on now is actually the most exciting. And I would endorse that 100% to the players.
I think it just always comes back to the point that, why do we play games? It's to have fun. And why do we make games? It's so that people can have fun playing them. And, and when you're a company, you want as many people as possible to have fun playing those games, because then you're going to continue to be able to survive as a company and grow. So which is the way that is going to give the most people fun? And of course, there's going to be people that will not have any fun from that because for them it's unfair or whatever. But often in things, there's a vocal minority who, you see the posts all the time. But in reality, most people will just find that super fun. And unfortunately, you can't always please everyone, and you are, as a good business decision, are going to try and please the bigger group of people, because that's your market, right? So I'm sorry, but that's just kind of how things work.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, and I've thought along this lines a little bit, and this made me come to the conclusion that games are on the spectrum between being a toy and being a sport. And so what I mean by that is, like, a toy is something that is just purely there for fun and is supposed to just delight the person, and they just play with it. But then a sport is something that, yes, can be fun, but it has some level of like competitive integrity, and that like you can have a winner and that sort of thing. And so if games were purely toys, I think we would end up having less fun, because if the fairness element is part of the enjoyment of a game, but I don't think it's the whole factor. But like, say, to use football as an analogy, if a game of football is slow or boring, they're not going to change the rules. Like, football is not going to be in any danger. It's going to stick around, right? But if a toy is boring, if it no longer delights you, you're just simply not going to use it again. So the games that we create, they need to be fun and they need to delight people. They are like a toy. And I think that some players would lean more towards the sport side of the spectrum. If you love chess, for example, that yes, it's sort of fun and it might delight you, but like you're enjoying the sport element more. And if you enjoy like, Uno or like party games, then you're leaning towards the toy side of the spectrum. And ultimately the designer has to land the plane somewhere. And we want our games to have competitive integrity, but there are always, always, always trade-offs there.
Coming back to Scythe, this is something I wanted to mention earlier when we were talking about the starting island and the boards and how maybe your board doesn't line up well with your resources and stuff like that. But the reality is, how many people are going to play a board game 50 times, 20 times? In today's market, not that many. And the thing is, that sort of thing isn't really going to matter if you're playing the game couple of times, 3 times, 5 times, 10 times. And if the designer's making the game more fun for those first 10 plays, they're probably actually the game's going to do better than if they're going to make it fun for the person who's going to play it 50 times, And so that's kind of, unfortunately for the person who wants to play the game 3,000 times, that makes it hard for designers to please you, because when there's that trade-off between, is it going to be fun for the first 3 times or is it going to be fun in 3,000 games time? The way the market works at the moment, the designer's going to choose having the first plays of the game being fun and drawing you back in. I don't think the kind of problems with Scythe are a problem really for the game, because I think the game makes that the first times you play it, those puzzles are so interesting. Yeah, maybe they come apart when you've played it like 20, 30, 40 times. There's some problems there, but I don't think we can really criticize the game for that. I think it's just super fun the first times you play it, and the puzzle's so interesting, and I think that's what he was going for.
Yeah, one of the things I learned really quickly when working on game design, and I learned from Shem, especially from when we worked on Architects, was that tension towards the end of the game is really, really important. Like, it's a sin almost of game design for a game to overstay its welcome, because then that last feeling, that feeling about the game that persists, was that, oh, it dragged on and it wasn't exciting towards the end. And so I learned really quickly that, Shem, thank you, about like, we want to have tension, we want to have people on the edge of their seats, and we want that, if we can, to ramp up towards the end of the game. And I think Scythe hits on that really, really well. One knock against my favorite board game of all time, Terra Mystica, is that actually the last round is kind of a bit rote. It's a bit boring. Everyone has already planned their line. They've planned their strategy in that last round, and then it's just a matter of just dotting the I's and crossing the T's and hoping to get those points at the end of the game. There are a few ways you can swing and get in people's ways at the end of the game and go for some majorities in the tracks, but by and large, the last round is not that exciting. Where I think where Terra Mystica is great is that at the start of the game, all the options that are available to you, all of that planning, all of that crunch at the start is so delightful. And I think that Scythe actually ends better than Terra Mystica, even if it might not always be finding the best player at the table, because seeding order could matter in that regard. I think it just leads to more excitement.
What you were saying earlier, Zach, about the short-term plays versus long-term plays, I actually think Scythe did a perfect job on this game. We mentioned a bit earlier, I mentioned earlier about some of the factions being better for early players and some rewarding more experienced players. This game, I think, walks that line really well. Like, it's very accessible, yet still complex in its own way. The way that the action taking is so simple, yet the spiral of decisions kind of is complex. Also, like, just to talk a bit about hype and about, I guess, about Stegmaier a little bit, like, this game is a masterpiece. It really is. And it came out at a time that really shook up the market a lot with Kickstarter and with just this kind of game, which is somewhat of a hybrid Euro, but with amazing production and visuals. Like, the art is just outstanding. The production's amazing. The UI of the player boards, like you mentioned earlier, Zach, is so good. The green versus red iconography and the slots of pieces unlocking abilities and reducing costs. Using plastic versus wood for different reasons mechanically. And there's so much good things going on here. I think it's just really a great masterclass in game design. And then one that I think is worthy of the hype. That's what I'll say. That this game is not just like overhyped. This is a brilliant game. Now, it's not a game that you might love. It's not a game you might want to play over and over again. That comes down to taste, I think. But as a design kind of a viewpoint, I think this should be definitely admired and, I guess, respected from a design point of view and from a publishing point of view. That they just knocked it out of the park, and it's due the praise that it got and continues to get as well.
We hope you've enjoyed our discussion about Scythe, but we'd love to hear from you. Jump on the Garphill Games Discord and let us know on the podcast channel if you've played Scythe. Do you enjoy the core action loop? What are your thoughts on the in-game trigger? What is your favourite in-game trigger in any game? Okay guys, if you could only play board games from one genre for the rest of your life, which genre would it be?
I wanted to pick something out of the box, something that's like, you never would have guessed this, but I would love to play this over and over again. But sadly, I'm quite predictable, and I am in my little sandbox that I enjoy. So, but with a caveat, I have decided to choose, I guess, medium weight, maybe even light to medium weight Euro games. So not heavy, just there's a little bit of a thing there. Because I just love how many there are and the variety of gameplay you get out of them. You can have worker placements, you can have hybrids, you can have tile placement and all sorts of games go on. You can have deck builders and all these crazy kind of mechanisms going on. And there's a lot of innovation in this space, a lot of games coming out from different designers. maybe they're not the games that you want to play over and over again, but at least there's a ton of variety and new games coming out. And there are also games that cross between games I'd want to play, say, with you guys, people who like more complex games and more involved games, but also games I can play with my family, which aren't super complex. So that they're kind of just below medium weight Euro is kind of a sweet spot for games I can play with a range of people and also get a lot of enjoyment out for myself as well.
Great answer. I feel like I have to say the same thing, otherwise I lose my job. Like I'm not allowed to work on my games.
You can say dudes on a map, Sam, it's all right.
If this counts, if this question is tabletop games, I think I'm actually saying card games. I think I'm actually saying like trick taking or card games because I've always enjoyed playing 4-player, 500. Now I'm loving Bridge, Regicide, a whole bunch of different card games. I think there's a level of accessibility that comes from them. It's almost like everyone knows card games. Everyone's played card games before. The fact that it's super transportable. There is still a lot of depth in some of these games. Even though you don't have all the pieces you're moving around, there's still a lot of room for strategy and excitement. And they're often quite fast. So you can get a lot of game played if you want to in a short amount of time. But I would be so sad about missing out on the medium heavy Euro games that we design and play. And I'd be so sad about losing out on dudes on the map games that I play once every 6 months, but my absolute favorite. So this is not a very nice question. I'm sad, I'm torn, but I'd probably go card games.
All right, Sam, I'll play those Euro games and I'll tell you about them. You can't play them. Yeah, I'll tell you about them. Yeah.
This is like Gimli. I can either stand on the box or you can explain it for me.
And Sam, I'll play those dudes on a map games for you because my answer would be dudes on a map games, or I don't know, maybe a better way to say it is like 3X games, just throughout the exploration.
Amen.
But I want the other 3Xs. Or like hybrid games, I guess is another way to say, like basically games that involve a heavy combat element, but also have kind of some Euro, some progression, some engine building elements in them. And there's a lot of good ones out there. I just love them so much, and maybe my choice will change in the future because my daughters are too young to learn board games. So maybe in a few more years, I'll be like, why did I choose to play this genre for the rest of my life? Now I can't play with my family, or else I'll just have to have them playing Chaos Order at like 7 or 8 years. I don't know. I just get the most enjoyment of sitting around the table with mates, strategizing over how I'm gonna outplay them, getting smashed in the face and just having to take it. I don't know. They're just, for me, it's the ultimate board gaming experience. And so that would be my genre.
I'm intrigued if there's an honorable mention for you guys.
Yeah, my honorable mention would definitely be medium to heavy Euro games. So think of like Gaia Project, Hansa Teutonica, those sorts of games are games that I really enjoy, but are not dudes on a map games. So
mine would probably be campaign games, I think, legacy games. Yeah, because you can play them for a long time, most of them. But also there's a big variety of style of legacy games. You've got stuff like my village, my city, whatever it's called, my island, those ones. Like the Knizia kind of ones, which are lighter family ones. And you've got huge beasts like Kings of Ruin and stuff. So
I set up that question so that you were going to say tile placement, and then I was going to give you a hard time about that. But then you go campaign, and I'm like, oh no, he's dodged it. But then you pick my city and my island, you tile placement man. Love it. I struggle with these tile placement games. I think they're fun. I think they're really interesting. I just cannot rotate the pieces in my mind. So I have to pick up the piece and rotate it to see how it looks on my board. I really struggle.
I've got to have an advantage in some areas, Sam. Come on. Can't win all the games.
So our next podcast will be about a tile placement game, I think, right?
Heck yeah.
A tile placement game about laying down tiles. We are tile placers.
I think these will find this.
Do you know that Tile Depot song? The tile placement,
No.
The Tile Depot advertising jingle? Oh, man. If you knew it, it would be a great time to sing it.
You going to sing it for us?
I suck. And who knows, you might actually just put it in the podcast display.
Too much risk.
Thanks for listening to the Lens and Veil podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Garphill Games. You can follow Garphill on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, and YouTube, or by joining the Garphill Discord server.
Jamey, we love you, bro.